Welcome to Literacy Talks, the podcast for literacy leaders and champions everywhere, brought to you by Reading Horizons. Literacy Talks is the place to discover new ideas, trends, insights, and practical strategies for helping all learners reach reading proficiency. Our hosts are Stacy Hurst, a professor at Southern Utah University and Chief Academic Advisor for Reading Horizons, Donell Pons, a recognized expert and advocate in literacy, dyslexia, and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, an elementary classroom teacher, author, and speaker. Now, let's talk literacy.
Hello, welcome to this episode of Literacy Talks. My name is Stacy Hurst, and I am joined by Donell Pons and Lindsay Kemeny. And this week, we are going to talk about, we're going to be talking about the research to implementation, research to practice gap is what's commonly called, I guess. But what spurred this was a blog post written by Margaret Goldberg. And I know it is on on a lot of different websites, but I accessed it on the Right to Read website, and it is a blog from August 7th called Doubt Crept In, Questioning My Faith in Reading Research. Because really she's highlighting, she's a practitioner, so how do we use research in the best ways to guide our practice? So there's a lot here. When I say research to practice gap, what do the two of you think of? What comes to mind?
Well, I think there's a huge gap. And I just think about sometimes we're kind of in our own islands. You have researchers on one side, and we have teachers in the classroom doing, the teaching every day. And there's not a lot of communication between them. And so I think it's a huge problem. But what do we do about it? It's I don't know. There's a lot we could talk about here.
Yeah. Donell, what do you think?
Gosh, I agree. And I also often think of those big terms we get like phonemic awareness. What does that look like in the classroom? What does it look like with this typical classroom? What does it look like with someone who had difficulty in that area? What do I do? What are the things I actually do? Boy, there's a lot of room in there.
Yeah. And I know that this is a topic that is coming up more and more. I feel like that might be because more of us know about the science that goes into reading and reading development. But what I am curious about is what are some of the things that bring this gap to light in our own experiences? Like, I'll give you an example that the author shares. She's talking about just that she was applying some of these things in her classroom, assuming they were backed by research. She actually quoted Julie Washington, if I can find it, who says everything's backed by research, but bad research exists. And so how do we bridge that gap? And I'm thinking about all the balanced literacy practices that I applied in my classroom, trusting that there was research behind them. I knew about the practices before I knew about the research. And once I learned the research, it was a big job to fill in that gap. Like, how do you apply this in the classroom? So all kinds of thoughts about that. Donna, what are you thinking?
It does bring to mind, she also mentions an experience at the Scientific Study of Reading conference, and where she has this realization that, they're looking at a lot of things that just don't have a ton of relevance in a classroom. And that's true. When I attended once, we shared about that experience I had down in Newport. And there are parts of it where you're like, wow, this is so cool. And it was David Kilpatrick, who had said, you need to go. If you get a chance, go. And in many ways, it's like, oh, you can't unsee that. Where you're looking at, why are we asking that question? It doesn't really have a ton of relevance. And finding about how much there is a distance between the actual what happens in a classroom every day, Monday through Friday, and what somebody finds interesting to research in a research setting. Wow.
Yeah. And the setting, that's key, right? Lindsay.
Oh, well, I just want to clarify because I almost think a little differently of the terms research and science. And Julie Washington had said it was bad science, right? Or that, but like it had been scientific, but it wasn't good science. And so I just think about that when, she's talking about 3Qing, and there isn't solid research to support it, but maybe the process of it was science. I don't know. In my head, I'm thinking of those as different things. But yeah, so research is like a lot of research studies are focused on these like isolated things, and they're really controlling for all the variables, right? And Margaret's talking about how, but then you go in the classroom and you don't have that controlled environment. So, and so sometimes the intervention or whatever doesn't work. And then researchers might point their fingers or blame teachers saying, oh, you didn't do it with fidelity, or maybe not the researchers, but whoever, administration, anyone. But teachers are like, well, I didn't have this beautiful controlled setting that you had. This is real life. And this is like how it works here. And so, that's why I got so excited when we listened to Dr. Tiffany Hogan at Big Sky, because she was talking about implementation science. And we need, I think, more people trained in implementation science who can really, focus on how we apply these things in the classroom.
Yeah, and the way that our education system is set up, we haven't historically had that role. Literacy coaches come close in the realm of literacy, but we still need systemic support too. And I do want to add one clarification. Thank you, Lindsay, for pointing this out. I must have said there was bad research. I should have said there were bad research designs. So there could be bad science for sure. I do understand and agree with you on the distinction. One example of that, and this is the beginning of the semester for me, so I've been telling my students about research studies in the past, but Goodman's psycholinguistic guessing game, that was a poorly designed research study. And it didn't even, I'm guessing, when they reviewed their research studies for the National Reading Panel, it probably wouldn't have even met the qualifications, right? So knowing that, though, whose role is it to know that? And that implementation person, I think, that's the key, to understand the science well enough to translate it to practice.
And that was my question. Who is trained in implementation? Whose job is it to do this?
So implementation science made its debut, I should say, in around the 2000s. So it's a newer science for one thing. And that's just in general, not necessarily in reading or education. But that's a great point, because our education system was not designed to account for that. I don't know.
Yeah, so this is an interesting point, because I'm familiar with Barbara Wilson talking about the science of implementation. And that had a whole different background to it, about understanding the role of people in the environment, what the environment looks like, to then understand what it is you're trying to bring to the environment, the different elements, who will teach, how will you measure. So you're right, there's a real science, and some folks who've done some study and some work, and she's got a paper, Barbara Wilson, that she put out a little while ago with the help of some others who do research in this area. So initially, when we were chatting about this topic, I was thinking, oh, is that what we're talking about? But then there was this other thing that we started out today talking about, and that is research to practice. So I think keeping all these terms kind of clear too, because they can get muddied. That's something different that we're talking about here. We're talking about the research that is done in institutions and taking that into schools. Now, how that gets done in schools, that's where, the implementation, the science of implementation can come into play. So I think that's important too, that there are different, shall we say, fields of study, areas of expertise that need to come together in order for this to happen well in our institutions. And I'm going to add another complicating factor, and that is AI, the introduction of AI. So how can AI help facilitate some of this? How is it already sort of pushing on facilitating some of this? I think that's an interesting thing too. We're living in this space.
And I'm glad you mentioned Barbara Wilson, because that's where I was first introduced to the concept of implementation science. It was at a conference and she was presenting about it. What I do remember, and this probably would have been around 2010, 11 or 12, somewhere in there. And what I do remember is that she said going forward, at the time it was Wilson. I'm not sure if foundations existed. I don't know that product well enough. But she said going forward, we won't allow one teacher to adopt the product. If it's a tier 1 thing, it has to be supported by the principal in the school. And that was based on her research of implementation science. I also remember at the time being asked to present at a conference about implementation and science. And so I went full blown into what she talked about. I can tell you it's probably the least effective presentation I've ever given in my career. People were looking at me so blankly, right? Like they had never heard the term, had no idea what it was. I think there was some relationship between, we know research into practice is hard. But again, I think that implementation science, like you just said, Donell, is the missing link. It needs to go in between that. Need to apply it. So and I think it goes both ways too, because researchers will, like we've already pointed out, research a very specific thing. And it may be 3 or 4 steps away from the impact that would have on student outcomes, right? Or even the way that a teacher would present that in the classroom. But I also think we have in this blog post at one point, and I don't remember who it was that said this. You guys help me remember if you remember, but they said the researchers need to stop researching because we haven't caught up with them in practice yet. And I when I read that, I remember being shocked, like, no, because research does happen slowly. It does take some time just by nature to get implemented into the classroom. But I have seen things the other way as well. In practice, for example, I have seen that decodable text is very important for our students. There's not a ton of research that answers the question, how much decodable text, for how long, and how decodable, right? So there's some research that we could use there, but we know I'm not going to abandon that practice right now. There are some are there areas that you guys feel like we are lacking that research that you see in practice that is effective?
I'm going to jump right in and just say specifically in the area of dyslexia. Yes, I think for too long it's been a blunt instrument. I'm just going to put it that way. So in other words, we're applying large concepts, and oftentimes you'll have students with really unique characteristics, but yet consistent. And you know that there should be more that you can do. I like Stanislaus Dehaene for this reason, because he kind of presses on this topic quite a bit and says that we need to understand and puts it to dyslexias. He puts a plural behind it. There are many dyslexias. Boy, that was, when he first said that, people were like, what is he talking about? Oh my goodness, how controversial. But if you work with folks day in, day out who specifically have challenges in this area, you see these things. And when he says those things, they speak to you and you say, yes, tell me more about that. I'd like to hear more about that. So that's an area where I wish we were pushing more information would be out there to be shared.
Yeah, I love that. Lindsay.
Oh, I would add, so I agree with you mentioned the decodable text. I think phonemic awareness is another one, especially on the implementation of it. And, that's an area that's all, there's a lot of debates and all this, noise going on about it. And so a little more focused on exactly how and how do you best help someone who is struggling to blend phonemes. And I think I would like to see more research on the use of small groups and practice, because we have the phonics lesson, and we know there's research with explicit phonics instruction, but what about how much practice students need and how to best get that practice with feedback in the classroom? Those are just some off the top of my head.
Lindsay, I'm just going to dive into right after you because I'm like, boy, that list could go on and on and on. I saw you struggling to come up with what would I put at the top on, just being asked right now, what would I put to the top of my list? But it's a long list. And I know that, thank you very much for trying to whittle that down to a couple for us here. The challenge for me oftentimes too is we get this concept and some people even might write a little bit on it. So phonemic awareness, that's one we've had more written on than not. But even then, the practical element of, so what does that really look like in a classroom? And so we had for years people that were like, well, so then every student everywhere, all the time in every classroom, and no, and it's certain ways. And then how quickly do you tie that to a letter? Do you see how quickly it's just me just kind of bringing up these little pieces? We're getting into a lot of different areas. Lindsay brought up some of the challenges of that, and just me going, yeah, Lindsay, let me pick up one thread of that, the phonemic awareness piece. And then let's talk about if we did that whole class and if is that every student and then what grades right away. Wow. It's complicated.
It's complicated. And what about what grade level is the child? Do they know their alphabet or do they not know it? And how automatic are they with that knowledge? And if they're not automatic, is that getting in the way of phonemic awareness practice? And then is it more helpful to do some phonemic awareness without the letters before adding the letters? There's a lot of nuance here. And sometimes I get frustrated by like blanket statements from people, or that will criticize a teacher. They see a teacher say they do something, or they, and instantly kind of on them like, oh, you should only be doing phonemic awareness with letters. And I'm like, hang on, there might be a situation here that you don't know about,
I'm also thinking, as I read this blog post about the mechanism of research, right? I think of it as top down. Research has existed, then teachers become aware, and even if it's about poorly designed research studies, right? Teachers become aware and then they implement. What I'd like to see more of is what you guys both just highlighted. Let's start with the application. Let's start with classroom or the student, and then inform the researchers. We'd like research on this, right? Teachers, I think action research is an area I'm becoming increasingly interested in. And maybe that's one of the things we do. But what do you guys think about when I say that? Do we have avenues in place for teachers to say, hey, we'd like research on this? And where does it go?
As you're saying that, Stacy, that is fantastic. And yes, I've heard about situations like that. They're typically, I've heard about, oh, there's a Stanford school. You'll meet somebody who was teaching at Stanford. They'll tell you about this fantastic situation where they had a sort of lab school. And I think, oh my gosh, that's an amazing scenario. But if this was more typical rather than atypical, and we had more education programs at universities, that a whole portion is to be what is on the ground. What are you doing on the ground to work with schools in your area so that you're developing this information? That's really expected rather than an add-on or something extra, but it's expected that that'll just be a base part of the program because you need it. And then I'm going to argue too, Stacy, let's take it a step further as I tried to drop into the conversation because I know it's not a fun one to pick up because there's a ton to it. But even now I'm saying, how about tech companies with AI? And they should be getting in this game early. We should have learned from the past and said, instead of later trying to figure out, oh, how do we all understand AI and its impact on education? We should all be right now working together. So I want to see them at conferences. I would love to see more of that at a conference too, and saying, you know what, this is going to be a big part of education going into the future.
So being proactive rather than waiting to be reactive about that.
Yeah.
That's a great comment. This is also a comment that I pulled from the blog. It is the job of researchers to research. We are not trained in implementation in the school context. That in and of itself, we could discuss, right? Translation should be the work of schools of education, curriculum developers, professional development providers, etc. Thoughts?
Okay, I'm sorry to jump in here, but I had a quote come to my mind just as you said that. And it was, never trust a skinny chef. In other words, don't trust a cook who doesn't eat their own food. I'm sorry, but that's what came to mind is, you have to, don't trust someone who tells you from a distance in an isolated incident, take this thing and run with it. I want to see them take the thing, put it in, sit with it, see what it looks like. Let's take it all the way rather than just to the front door. I don't know. Lindsay, help me out here. I'm all over the place.
This is hard because when I read that quote, I was thinking, well, who is trained in implementation? Like, who is? And all these people, they mentioned, okay, yes, schools of education should be deep in research, but they're, and hopefully they're partnering with nearby schools, but they may or may not be. You have curriculum developers who, to be honest, might be more interested in making sales. And they're usually like, what does the customer want versus what does research say? And then let's design something according to that, and, the same thing with professional development providers. Well, hopefully they are very much taking that research, but again, do they have partnerships with the schools? And same, I was going to say with the curriculum developers, hopefully they are testing, researching what they are putting out into schools before selling it, right? There's so many different. So it's just hard because whose job is it? And then also with the research coming out, whose job is it to disseminate that to teachers? Because let me tell you, teachers do not have time to be seeking out studies and reading studies. We have 1,000 other things that we are doing every day, and we have to be preparing what we're going to do tomorrow, right? And that's not even if you have to create your own lesson plan, which sometimes teachers have to do. I mean, it should be, for you. You don't go work at, a coffee shop and then they say you have to bring your own coffee beans, right? They provide them. And that's how it should be for schools too. I saw some little video like on social media that was, it was really funny, but they were relating teaching to like working at a coffee shop. Anyway, so I just think, as a teacher, like, yes, I like to stay close to research and pay attention to research, but I don't expect that of all teachers. Some of us are very, passionate, obsessed, nerdy. But I wouldn't expect all teachers to be doing that. I think there needs to be someone who has more time to do that stuff to be able to read through it and help teachers implement and share the knowledge with them.
Interested in diving deeper into today's episode and exploring more literacy topics? Join us in the Science of Reading Collective, where we host the Literacy Talks podcast chat. It's the perfect place to share insights, ask questions, and keep the conversation going. But that's just the beginning. When you join the Science of Reading Collective, you're stepping into a vibrant, dynamic community explicitly designed for literacy champions like you. Access decodable text, sound wall resources, and professional learning in our AI-enhanced community, all brought to you absolutely free. Find us at collective.readinghorizons.com. Join the Science of Reading Collective today and be part of a movement that's eradicating illiteracy. That's collective.readinghorizons.com.
So I remember teaching first grade, and as many of you who've listened to the podcast know, I turned to research early in my career, thankfully the National Reading Panel. But I do remember that. I wish I had more time to really dive into this. What I read, I had to apply on the fly, and a summer is not enough to build the background knowledge you need, because when the minute those students show up, you don't have time for any sort of study, right? I do recall when I became an implementation coach, I was able at that point to spend more time in the research. But then to your point, Lindsay, how do I help my teachers implement that? Is this my job? I think it is, but it can't be just on me, right? And I feel like as you're talking too, I was thinking researchers need to research and teachers need to teach. But it's not common to have researchers that are currently teaching a full class all day, all the things. And it's not common having a teacher who can be knee deep in research either. So how do we bridge that gap in a way that's meaningful for our students and our teachers who are required to implement these things?
That's that expectation that we were talking about, right? So you're swimming upstream if it isn't already something the system acknowledges that needs to be changed, right? Or needs to happen. So that's the other thing. One great light here, you get burned out pretty quickly. Or once you're gone, what's left after if you're not there to push it? So that's, I think, what I see happening a lot in different schools and buildings and places is you'll have folks who get together and you might have a great team, but the minute that dynamic changes, there isn't anything in place structurally that has really changed about it in order to see that next year you're going to have just as good, or 5 years from now, trust me, we will, or 10 years and so on. So I think that's a challenge. Again, is systemic. I think it's a system and an expectation. And I think that this is a season, as I said, with AI really changing education, we have an opportunity to make some of these system changes. They might be forced on us if we don't.
Yeah, I think the other thing I wanted to highlight in this blog post was actually a couple of the comments. One was from Stephanie Stoller, who really brought to the conversation that MTSS is that structure because it allows for the process of implementation and all of its complexities, right? Because it's not one and done, I wish. And then also Linda Diamond had something I thought was really astute and kind of clear about the whole situation. She said, "This is a thought-provoking piece and a warning, like you're saying, Donell, to us all, to all of us. Knowing what research says and translating it into effective practices requires diligent stamina. We can learn from high-performing schools and educators that consistently, keyword there, get strong results for marginalized populations. But we also need to understand how learning happens, and that means bringing cognitive science into educator preparation and to instructional materials. And it means translational research and mixed methods can be rich sources of learning. We also need to remember that schools are, as Dr. I never can say his name, Kamenui cautioned, complex host environments." And I think, yeah, I'll just pause there. Anything that stood out to you as I read that?
So Stephanie Stoller's comment on the MTSS. Yeah, I mean, there's a framework if we're talking about systems, but how many schools are you aware of that don't really have a functioning, or even educators today who still, when you say that, will say, so tell me a little bit more about that. That's wow, right? So again, it would have to be something that a system that we respect and we utilize, right? And if we can't even do MTSS, and a lot of teachers aren't even aware of what it is, that tells you the challenge we're up against, right? What we're facing doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah. And translating the science is something that stood out to me. And I think the three of us went through, we had many of conversations as this was happening in real time. But as you recall, when the focus became on phonemic awareness with letters was kind of instigated by Mark Seidenberg stating that very emphatically, which again, none of us argue with that, right? It's a matter of when, but the timing of that, he's definitely more of a researcher than a practitioner. And I think there were others who helped mitigate, because I felt like teachers got really turned upside down by that. And there were others who helped mitigate by saying, now, hold on, like you just did, Lindsay, when we were talking, you were talking about it. Now, hold on, let's look at when and for whom and how much. But that's what we risk. If we don't have the people, the role identified, whose job is it to translate? What do you think?
Well, so we need those independent research studies and those isolated like research studies too, right? Of course, we need those because if you're going to add in the implementation science, you probably first want to look at, see if was support in this other context, right? Before you're going to implement it. Of course, as Dr. Hogan said a couple weeks ago, teachers are the ultimate implementation scientists. That's because we're the ones figuring out how to do it and then doing it in the classroom. We just need more support, I think, doing that. But so what is my job as a teacher? Okay, I'm going to make sure I'm as informed as possible. Sometimes I have to cut out the noise. So sometimes I hear people arguing like, is a phoneme a thing or not? And I'm like, look, I know what I need to do in my classroom. I need to like tune that out and focus on helping this child blend phonemes because, well, that's what they need. So, focusing on that. And I can't just abandon something I'm doing because I hear one person say something. But I know from my experience, it seems to be helping. Okay. And then I've got to look closely at my data. And this is just another reason why we look at data. Yes, we're looking for individual students and what's happening with them, but you're also looking at your own data collectively to see, is there a problem like with our system? Is there a problem with what I'm doing in my class? Are the majority of students on, average or above average growth? Great. If there's a lot that are below or well below average growth, I need to change something because I'm not implementing something the best that it could be implemented, right? And so I have to watch my data. I have to make the best decisions I can with the knowledge I have. I can't wait for research, or I can't wait for this debate to be over and what's going to happen. I have to make the best decision I have with the knowledge I have right then. And so sometimes I get frustrated when we are overly critical of like teachers or what they're doing, because, I think a lot goes into it. Okay, so we're watching our data. Okay, so let's see what I say. Make sure you're informed. Make the best decisions you can right then. We can't wait. Watch your data. Respond to the data. You can't just watch the data. If you're not doing anything with the data, there's no point to give the assessment. So you need to respond and change things, right? And then I think also stay open and stay curious. Don't get too married to something you're doing, because you might find out that maybe there's something that's more effective.
So, Lindsay, what I loved about that is, you're laying out implementation science, right? So there's effective intervention times effective implementation times enabling context. That would mean you have support equals your intended outcomes. And intended outcomes means you know where you're headed, what you'd like to see. So we know that statistically we can have most of our kiddos reading at a certain level at a certain time, know where you want to go as well. So that's part of it. And this idea that the teacher, it should never have to be alone too. My heavens. But oftentimes that's when you make a visit and there's somebody who's reached out and said, hey, would you come? I'd like to hear you presented. I'd like to see, would you come in? And you find out they're very much alone. They're trying to do this monumental task, and there is no real system in place. And they're trying to be a single implementer, right, within their system. And you should never ask that of a teacher. So I would hope there's a couple of things that we know today, perhaps that maybe we didn't know. And today we should know that there's this thing called the science of reading. And within this thing called the science of reading, we have a lot of really great information because it's been carried out through research, because we made that difference between the science and the research. What does the research tell us about some of these findings? And the research has told us that certain things are very effective at teaching people to learn to read. And they can be really effective for certain populations, and then overall just very effective. So let's use them in our classrooms. And we have some of these key pieces, critical pieces. The jury's out on a few things. We still need some additional information on a few things, but that doesn't mean that we close our eyes or our minds to some of these things. That means that we continue to look for information that's coming and within play. We look to researchers, different researchers that are doing some of this. We look for the books that come out. We look for articles that come out, but we're not doing that alone. So I don't want to see teachers having to do that. As you said, Lindsay, who's got time for that as a teacher? You don't bring your own beans to the coffee shop. Somebody's provided the beans. So at those schools, how are we providing the beans for the teachers? In other words, who's providing that information? So we should have professional development that's given to the teachers, and it's given in a way in which teachers can use it too. Don't just hand them raw pieces, right? Yet again, what are we really providing for our teachers that's really good, effective?
And that
right?
collaboration, I think, let's go back to the coffee shop metaphor. What happens at coffee shops, right? We hang out and talk. And I'm thinking specifically because I had a colleague encounter Dr. Seidenberg's supposition. That's not the right word, that phonemes are an illusion. And they might be, they really might be. But the fact is, in our conversation, and she was very disturbed by that, but in our conversation, I was able to say, but our alphabet is based on phonemes. It's a Phoenician alphabet. Like, we have to acknowledge that in practice, because that's the structure of our print. So they may be on some levels illusory, but how would, if we didn't have people to talk to about it, like you're saying, Donell, teachers would just be left on their own to do that. I also, when we're talking, Lindsay, you mentioned being informed about the science. A big part of that is you need to know enough. I'm not saying you need to know everything, right? You need to know enough about how the brain learns to read. We need to know enough about that to help us make those in the moment decisions. And really, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to piggyback on that, because that I was saying, the teachers need to be informed, but like we're saying, teachers need support. So in addition to that, our administrators need to be even more informed. Our coaches, our district leaders need to be even more informed, because in my opinion, they have a little more time that maybe they could devote to that. And then they decide what to disseminate to teachers. And I feel like, and then they need to listen to teachers. And support them. I heard someone saying, where they were telling me how this third party company came to work with their school. And she said, I felt like they would come in and do observations, and then they would come and tell us everything we did wrong. And that was it. It was nothing like, what do I do instead? What do I support? And I heard this other story of someone that was part of a huge observation team and felt like they just went in and basically watched a teacher struggle for 30 minutes. So we need to turn those observations around into coaching opportunities.
Agreed. And I think even in this conversation that we've had that's been very robust, I think the very glaring thing is, in all those people you named, and we could say the administrators, the literacy coaches, and teachers, right, support people, but also people who are providing professional development, whether they're in the school system or not, and curriculum providers, materials. Out of all of those, who is trained in implementation science? Who is focusing on that? And I do think if we have the structure in place, like the MTSS model is a great start. And I learned some things from that too. It takes 3 to 5 years to really implement change system-wide, right? Who knows that? Like, who is saying it's okay that your data is not growing as much as you think it is? This is going to take time. That's okay. The other thing I want to point out, go ahead, Donell.
And Stacy, the really important thing you just said right there is legislators are more involved in this process than ever before, because, thankfully we've gotten some momentum there, and a lot of this is the science of reading based, and they're making determinations and saying that things need to look different in different states. But that thing about 3 to 5 years, make sure you understand as a legislator, this is in for the long haul as well, because it'll need sustained support, right?
Yeah. And kind of related to this, like that, I think as educators, most of us feel a certain way when we hear the word fidelity. And I think part of the reason that I always ask the question, what is fidelity, is to what? And how is it researched? And in what scenario? But I'm using fidelity with my students, with what I have learned works, that's aligned with the science. So I don't ever want to replace that teacher knowledge. I appreciated, Lindsay, that you said stay curious. And I know teachers don't have a ton of time. You have a lot of subjects to cover and a lot of things to prepare for. But any chance you get to learn more, right? Even if it's just a podcast or a blog post, there's a lot thought-provoking information out there. One piece of research that I think is encouraging is 95% of students can learn to read, barring intellectual hiccups, you can call them, by the end of first grade. And I feel like sometimes we feel bad if our students aren't at that 95% point. But this is where implementation science can 100% come in and say, it's going to take time to get there. You can't do that in one day or 1 year. So lots of things.
And Stacy, I've really appreciated being able to have this conversation because it's so important. And if our little conversation here hasn't illustrated just how difficult and how multifaceted this is, then and it needs continued conversation centered around it as well. But also when you were talking about that 95%, and then there's also that percentage where a lot of students that I work with fall, had we done better because we knew better, would be in a much better place today. So that's the other thing is we don't have time to waste. And those early years are so valuable. You can do a lot of really good work in those early years to help those students who will have a difficult time coming to reading. But that early work is so valuable. It's why this conversation is so important. Thank you.
Yeah. Lindsay, any closing remarks?
No, I just feel like I've been really ornery for this podcast. I'm like, I have some strong feelings on this topic in general. I'm just like, but I would just love to see more of a bridge between the research to practice. And I think implementation is the key. And I just, I don't know what the answer is. I can only do what I can control, but it's, when I hear about people talking about implementation science, it makes me get really excited because I think there is a lot of power there.
I agree. And I think it's an exciting time in education because people are becoming aware enough to ask these questions. And there's a lot of room for growth here. I have been asking this question. I've had conversations with my friends who teach at other universities. How do we open that highway between the classroom and what's being researched? And how do we go through that implementation piece in a way that benefits everyone? And I think we're going to see some really cool things in the future, but I feel like it's going to be hard work too. But we can just do the best we can do right in the meantime. So I really thank everybody who's joined us for this episode, no matter what your role in literacy is. Hopefully it spurred some thoughts about how you can support implementation or maybe learn a little bit more about it. I know I'm going to be learning more about implementation science in general, but also how it relates to literacy. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Donell and Lindsay, for the conversation. I think we end every episode by saying we could go on and on about this topic too. So thank you. So for those of you who joined us this week, we hope you'll join us next week for another episode of Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Visit readinghorizons.com/literacytalks to access episodes and resources to support your journey in the science of reading.